Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Intercooler podcast with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. This is episode 246. Last week, it was French shitboxes.
Yes.
This week, it's Italian supercars.
Yes. But not 246s.
No. A very particular, very specific bloodline that we're talking about. But yeah, nothing if not a broad church here on the Intercooler podcast. Now, I put it to you, Andrew Frankel. We're talking about two-seat, mid-engined Ferraris.
Yeah.
And two-seat mid-engine V8 Ferraris.
Yes.
Right? And that bloodline now is 50 years old.
Well, yes, I suppose if you say two-seat,
yes
it is. Yeah. Okay.
It's because the Ferrari 308 it arrived in 1975. And the 308...
The GTB did.
Blimey.
Sorry.
308 GTB, you're right.
Well, because sorry, pedant's corner here. The 308 GT4,
yeah,
which was actually a Dino,
yes,
arrived in 1973.
Okay.
But because it has vestigial rear seats, that doesn't qualify here, does it?
No. So we're specifically talking about the 308 GTB that evolved into the 328, the 348, the 355, the 360, the F430, the 458, the 488. And that bloodline ends
with the F8.
With the F8.
Yes.
Yeah, because...
Well, can I just play an SF90 card?
Well, okay, hang on. This is why... This particular topic takes so much framing because on either side, either bookend, there are sort of question marks.
Exactly.
So as you've pointed out, there is the 308 GT4.
Yes.
There's also the 308 QV.
Yes.
Which is another four-seater.
No.
Oh, okay, fine.
No. Allow me to explain.
Yeah, okay.
In the beginning,
yes.
Are you sitting comfortably? All right. A quick potted history of V8 Ferrari. So the first Ferrari V8 wasn't a V8 at all.
Yeah.
It was a V8. It wasn't a Ferrari engine at all. This was in a Lancia. In the 1950s, a bloke called Vittorio Jano, who went on to design Ferrari's V6 engine, designed a V8 engine for Lancia to do Formula One in the 1950s. Lancia got itself into financial trouble, sold all its racing assets to Ferrari, which is having a terrible time in Formula One at the moment. And the Lancia D50, became rebadged a Lancia Ferrari, and Fangio used it to win the Formula One World Championship in 1956. That then became the Ferrari 801, but it wasn't Ferrari's engine. It was a Lancia engine, which found its way into a Ferrari. The first true Ferrari V8, I'm going to get really spotty now, came in 1961 in a very little known sports car called a 248 SP, which didn't do very much. That was succeeded in 1962 by the 268 SP, which was the same car with a slightly bigger engine. That did not very much either. The first sort of really notable Ferrari V8 was the V8 Formula One engine that powered John Surtees to the 1964 Formula One World Championship. 1.5 litre car. There was also, and he was also helped that year by a 1.5 litre flat 12.
Ooh.
I know. Can you imagine what that was?
Wow.
Yeah, one for Ferrari 1512.
Oh.
But yeah, so that was the first. But the 158 was the first really notable Ferrari V8. And then, yes, you're absolutely right. Spool forward, 1973, you then get the 308 GT4, which was the Bertone-bodied, slightly strange-looking mid-engine 2+2. Which was badged from 1973 to 1976 as a Dino and then became a Ferrari thereafter. 1975, the 308 GTB came along, Pininfarina design, utterly gorgeous, never Dino badged, and that's really where our story is starting.
Yeah.
And now there were so go back to your QV point, there were various versions of that engine. So there was the GTB, which was a 3-litre carb Feb, 255 horsepower claimed, probably wasn't that much engine. In 1980, that became the GTB-I because it got fuel injection. Power fell to 214 horsepower, one of the slowest Ferraris ever made. And then in 1982, it got a quattro valvole, cylinder heads, 4 valves per cylinder, so 32 valves. That's where the QV came from. And power went up from 214 horsepower to 240.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's where it all comes from. And then obviously you get into 328s and so on.
So what year was the QV?
QV of 1982, I believe.
Oh, much later. Okay. Yeah. So that's the bookend on the earlier side. And the bookend or the question marks on the latter side.
Yes.
So we know the 296 GTB, which is the successor to the F8 Tributo, is a V6, a V6 hybrid.
Of course.
And so for these purposes, it doesn't sit within that same bloodline. No. And so what about the Ferrari SF90 Stradale?
Yes.
That's a V8, mid-engine, two-seater.
Yeah.
But I would argue that belongs to a different bloodline again because, well, it doesn't follow in the tyre tracks of 308, 328, 348, 358. I think it sits outside of that.
It does.
That lineage.
It's a curious car.
Yeah.
Insofar as it's not a mainstream product. It's not a very good product in my view.
Yeah.
But it's one of those. It's strange because it's 1,000 horsepower. It's meant to be a sort of Ferrari hypercar. But it's not limited in production. And no, you're absolutely. It's not a mainstream Ferrari product. So, so if you look at the bloodline that was, I guess, actually started with the 246 of the sort of the entry level mid-engine Ferrari, which then became V8 in 1975. If you're talking about the two-seat versions, that did end with the cessation of production of the F8 in when would the F8 have stopped?
22 around there, something like that.
Yeah.
So there is a bloodline that. It's a complicated thing, but for the sake of argument, we can say there is a bloodline that begins with the 308 GTB in 1975 and ended with the F8 Tributo in around 22.
Yes.
So that bloodline is now 50 years old.
Yes. Ish. Yeah, no, it is. It is. It is. I understand. I understand what you're getting at.
Yes. Okay. Now, is it the greatest supercar bloodline there's ever been and ever will be?
Would you not say that the Ferrari V12 was a good candidate for that?
I would. I would also say the Lamborghini V12.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think what it did do was, I was about to say democratize, but I think in terms of Ferraris, that's probably not the right word to use. But it did make the whole Ferrari experience much more accessible.
Yeah, yeah.
Brought it to an audience which otherwise could never have imagined having a car with a Ferrari badge on it. I also think that the starting point, the 308 GTB, although a very flawed car in many ways, it was a design icon. You look at one now, they are just... And I think that with that engine and that shape, and the fact that it was a lot cheaper than what people traditionally expected to spend on a Ferrari, I think it's an incredibly important bloodline, certainly.
Yeah.
And it kept going and going and going. And actually, I think one of the most extraordinary things about it is in those 50 years, they've basically done it all on two engines. If you look at the sort of the basic architecture, the design, the 308 engine went all the way up to the 360 Modena.
Did it really?
Yeah.
Including the 360
Including the 360 Modena.
Wow.
And then the engine that came after that, which is the one they also used for Maseratis and goodness knows what else, is essentially the engine that's in the SF90 today, and was in the F8.
Yeah, that is amazing.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that really is incredible.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, changed beyond all recognition, and not insignificant things like it got turbocharged.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay, so greatest supercar bloodline ever. It's clearly a highly debatable point. Clearly, all it comes down to individual opinion, but you could argue the case that this is that. It's certainly a strong candidate for that.
It's also got another claim to fame.
Go on.
Smallest V8.
Yeah.
Road car. The 208.
Yeah. So 2-litre turbocharged.
2-litre turbocharged. Well, no, they did it initially. It wasn't turbocharged.
Oh, they were initially naturally aspirated. Yes.
Yeah, naturally aspirated.
Yeah.
This was an
Turbo
Italian.
came later.
This was an Italian market car.
Yeah.
Because there were massive tax implications if you had a car with more than 2 litres. So they just sleeved down. They left the stroke as what it was, but they cut the bore down to whatever was required to make it a sort of 1991 cc's. I can imagine that a normal 208 GTB could barely get out of its own way. Must be, certainly the least powerful Ferrari V8 there's ever been.
No, so they sleeved it down, which means a longer stroke, relatively speaking.
Correct.
Why not just make it an over square engine, very, very short stroke, rev it to the heavens, make power that way.
I imagine it's just easier to stick sleeves in.
Yeah,
I think massively easier just to leave everything as it is, but just to cut the bore size down. I can't imagine, because yes, I mean what you would do if you're being purist about it is you'd make it a screamer.
Yeah.
You'd massively cut the stroke, make it rev to 9,000, and everybody would be going happy days. But I think, given that this was a tax break special,
that wasn't the reason.
That probably wasn't what was Ferrari's prime motivation for doing it.
No. Okay. 308 then. 308 GTB. How are they to drive?
Honestly?
Oh, I thought you were going to say lovely in that way of yours.
They weren't that great.
Oh.
I'm sad about this, because I know that there'll be people to whom these cars are icons, and there will also be people who've driven them and probably driven them, further and faster than I have, who will go, you know what you're talking about. But I have driven, a number of them over the years. They were lovely places to be. The cockpits are just brilliant. I'm incredibly happy to be on one, and you've got that beautiful sort of 3-spoked alloy-spoked steering wheel and the exposed gear lever and all those lovely little slider controls and really iconic instruments, and it's a real sense of occasion to be in it. But the truth is, and a lot of it did depend which one you were driving. The earlier cars, so there's the very first cars had plastic bodies, vetroresina, fiberglass. And Harry Metcalf had one for a while, didn't he? And they were a lot lighter, and they were quicker as a result. But then they went to steel bodies. My sense is that the level of performance that, let us say, a late 70s 308 GTB gave you was really no step up at all, maybe even a step down from what, not even a turbo, a fairly boggo 911 would give you.
Yeah.
In real terms. And if you look at what Ferrari are asking in terms of the price, which would have been hugely more. Now, I know that you're paying for exclusivity, you're paying for a look and everything else, but we tend to, don't we? Because it is the great sort of benchmark. We tend to revert to 911, and they just weren't. Like, the other thing about them too is, and I guess that most people didn't drive them like that, but they did do funny things on the limit.
Did they?
Yeah, and they weren't. I can remember really fighting with a 328 and thinking it really wasn't a nice car. Quite, when you're driving it that fast, and I guess most people didn't, so maybe it's not that relevant a point. And not as bad as a 348, which was absolutely horrible. They just weren't those cars that, we tend to judge cars, I think people like you and me do, so much by what they're like to drive in the way you would imagine their makers intended. So you're using all of the performance and all of the handling, and they just weren't that great. The engines are fantastic. The engines are beautiful. They make a very distinctive sound, like all Ferrari road car V8s, apart from the one that they put on the Lancia 832, which maybe we'll come to. They have flat plane cranks, not cross plane cranks, which is what most V8s have. And if anybody doesn't understand what I'm talking about, what it means is that the firing intervals are every 180 degrees rather than every 90 degrees. And in terms of harmonics, it's essentially divides the engine into two halves. You basically it's almost like two 4-cylinder engines sharing a common crankshaft, which is why they do sound quite like 4-cylinder engines. They do that because it allows them to rev high.
That's right. It's not that rumbly V8 that you get from a Detroit.
Exactly, or an AMG Mercedes.
Yeah, it's a very different sound.
It's a screamer.
Yeah.
And back in the mid-70s, 308 GTB would get to nearly 8,000 RPM. When you try that in anything out of Detroit from that era and see how you get on. And so they were real screamers. And they were sort of 8/10 cars. There was a mode you could get into very easily where you're using all the revs and you've got that wonderful gear shift. And they did steer quite accurately and they had quite a lot of grip. And And if you were just driving them at 8/10, they were terrific. Great things to be in. And I think that's what most people did, and that's fine. It was only really when you started to push a bit further that, they just didn't behave themselves as I would like them to have done.
So the 1975 3.8 GTB, 252 horsepower.
On a good day.
On a good day.
I mean, this was back in the era where lots of car manufacturers were being accentuating the positive when it came to the outputs of their engines.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until 1985 that the 328 arrived.
Yes.
And I thought you were going to say that's when they sorted it, chassis-wise.
No, absolutely not.
So even that was not great. And then the 348 that came in 1989, 296 brake horsepower, was even worse.
That was really bad.
So what the hell was going on in Maranello at that
complacency.
time?
Just pure complacency. Yeah. And, you only have to look at the 355 and how they totally transformed it.
Yeah.
They didn't need to build cars that handled amazingly, which were, you could steer on the throttle, because these were Ferraris. They were the most desirable cars in the world. People bought them.
They looked great.
They looked fantastic. They sounded amazing. People bought them because they were Ferraris. And I think very few people ever found out the sorts of things which, to me, make them flawed and in some regards slightly, not disappointing, but never failed to fulfill their potential. And then, in the early 1990s, I mean, I've always put it down to the Honda NSX. This Japanese car comes along from this manufacturer of, little shitbox hatchbacks and is just extraordinary. And I think the whole world, certainly the European, the sort of blue-blooded European supercar, just, again, he just woke up and just thought, wow, we're going to have to raise our game. And if you look at the 348, to me, the great teller in this story is the 348 to the 355.
Yeah.
Because the 355 wasn't a new car. It was a facelifted 348. But in that facelift, they went from building their worst ever mid-engine car to one of the very best.
Yeah.
So what that says to me is that all along they could have done it.
It just wasn't important to them.
But just chose not to.
Yeah.
I drove a 348 not that long ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, at Bedford. In fact, there might have been 2 or 3 of them there, actually. And they were exactly the same. Nothing had changed. They were just...
So what's the problem? That just snappy and nasty on the limit?
Yeah, exactly that. So what would happen was you'd be accelerating out of a corner and the car would start to oversteer and you'd be thinking, oh, this is quite good fun, and then you'd be pointing in the direction you just come. They'd just go.
Oh, wow.
Beyond a certain level of slip, you just couldn't hang on to them. They just went. And that was horrible.
So it took Ferrari 20 years until the mid-90s with the F355.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think they always knew how to do it.
Yeah.
But then, it took Luca de Montezemolo to come back into the company and to really, say, not good enough, guys. A Ferrari can't just be fast and good looking. It has to be great to drive too. And suddenly, without even requiring an all new model, they totally transform this car. So they must have been able to do it.
It does sound like complacency.
Yeah.
It really does.
And the 355 is one of my favourite Ferraris.
Yeah. I'd love to drive one. I need to make that happen this year.
You need to make sure it's an early car.
Oh.
Early pre-airbag car.
Yeah.
Not because it doesn't have an airbag, but because the engine management was different, and the later cars were just sluggish.
Really?
Whereas the early cars were, that first 5 valve per cylinder engine goes to, I think, about 8.8 or something. Amazing motor.
Oh, I just think they look gorgeous.
They do look good, and it's the first of those cars, if you're talking about the bloodlines, we're not talking about 246s here, it was the first of those cars which was as good to drive as it was to look at.
Yeah.
You look at an F355 and there's nothing that car's appearance says about it which isn't delivered in full of the driving experience to come. And that's what I love about it. It just finally fulfilled the potential of that design.
So the 355, the early ones, 375 horsepower, again, maybe on a good day.
No, by then that would have been absolutely. I think it was actually with the in the early 80s when they injected the engines and the power output fell from 255 to 214, I think at that stage there was some regulation or something, and you couldn't be creative with the numbers at all. So no, if that's what a 355 was said to have, that's what it would have had.
Yeah. So 99, it was all changed really, wasn't it? Because the 360 was an aluminium car.
360, yes, and it was 360 is an incredibly important car because that's basically how Ferrari still make cars to this day. It was an aluminium space frame car, not a tubular car. It was the first Ferrari to employ the more modern construction techniques that they continue to use. Yeah.
395 horsepower, lovely looking thing.
Yeah.
And actually, you wrote about this quite recently. If you want a cheap Ferrari, if there is such a thing,
I don't understand why they're so affordable.
It's weird. So they are just about the cheapest Ferraris you can buy now. You might find like a snotty Mondial or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in terms of numerous options available, it is now a 360, which is amazing. I found a gorgeous looking one, a coupe, silver, manual, done a few miles, 78,000 miles, for 39,995.
Yeah.
So just shy of 40 grand.
If the car's been properly looked after, I wouldn't worry about those miles.
Yeah.
If it's had all the the cam belt changes or that it should have had, and it's all been done by people who know what they're doing. Frankly, I'd rather that than a car that's done 5,000 miles.
Yeah, not being used.
And not being used.
Yeah.
They did slightly strange things on the limit as well.
Really?
Yeah.
So a backward step from the 355?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, they were just... Wow. I mean, they weren't terrible like a 348, but they were just nervous. Nervous is the word.
Yeah.
When you turned in. I can remember one of the autocar handling days, we had one at Goodwood, which, as you know, is all, fast curves. And it would just, every time you turned into a quick corner, it would just oversteer slightly. And just enough me thinking, well, I'm doing 100 and something miles an hour. I don't really want this to be, I don't mind a bit of oversteer at the exit of the chicane when your foot's down. But as you turn in, and the only one that didn't do that, which we'll come on to, was the gorgeous Challenge Stradale.
Oh, yeah, we will come on to that one and all the versions that followed.
Yes.
So 2005 F430, an evolution of the 360, but better sorted now?
It was the first one with a new engine in it.
Okay.
I mean, funny, when I sort of think back to all those Ferraris, the F430 is the one that is least prominent in my mind.
Is it?
Because I don't think it ever particularly annoyed me or disappointed me like some of the earlier cars had done. And it didn't completely blow my mind like certainly the 355 did and some of the later ones. It's it's a really good version of one of those cars, but it's not a landmark in Ferrari design history to me at all.
And talking of design, that's a Frank Stephenson car, isn't it?
Yeah.
And just not as pretty as a 360, I don't think.
Not as pretty as a 360.
No.
But an important car because it's got the, it's got the engine in it that essentially they're still using today. So that marked the end of the engine, which had started life in 1973 in the 308 GT4. And it survived all the way up to the F430, and given that a version of it's still in the SF90, it survives to this day.
That is quite something. So F430, about 483 brake horsepower. I remember when the 458 arrived, 2008, 2009, and it felt like a massive leap in power.
Enormous.
562 brake horsepower. Until then it had basically been quite incremental, and then bang. 458, no messing about. And that was a very sophisticated car, wasn't it?
And I think that's one of the reasons the F430 probably does sort of sit in the shadows.
Yeah.
Because the 458 was just, I mean, it was just better in every way. It had that extraordinary engine, the last naturally aspirated Ferrari V8 engine. It looked, I still not sure there's been a better looking mid-engine Ferrari than that.
Really?
I think they look amazing. I mean, I say that because, Dinos and 308s are great looking cars too, but I do think they are stunning to look at, and they were fabulous to drive. And I don't mean Speciales, which was something else, just a standard car. a 458 Italia is just a lovely, lovely thing.
Mm.
It's one of those
I've
cars.
never driven one, actually. Only the Speciales. But, I mean, this was when Ferrari threw all, particularly the chassis electronics, at that car.
Yes.
You know, side slip control and adaptive damping and it's switchable ESP and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, but they handled beautifully.
Yeah.
They got back everything that they'd lost in previous years because, I mean, I can remember driving those things. You could just hurl them about the place and slide them here and there, and they never gave me a moment's cause for concern. Which, given that how much more momentum you've got compared to some of the earlier stuff, it just shows what they could do when they put their mind to it.
So 355 aside, really, you think the 458 was the first one to really handle beautifully?
Of that, well, you see, we're not talking Challenge Stradales just yet.
No.
The sort of the mainstream cars, yes, absolutely. Yeah, 355 showed that they could do it, and then the 458 really showed what they could do.
Yeah. It is hilarious, actually, that it took that long.
Yeah, but I mean, that's just me. I mean, there'll be people who are listening to this will go cobblers.
The amazing thing about this era, so 360 to 430 was a big power leap. 430 to 458 was a big power leap. 458 to 488 in 2015, almost another 100 horsepower.
Guys, the 488 10 years old.
Yeah. Oh, my God.
Gosh.
That's actually quite concerning because I very clearly remember driving one of those on a Evo Car of the Year. Must have been 2015.
Yeah.
Bloody hell.
And it wasn't just the power.
Twin turbo now.
That's the thing. It was the torque.
Yeah.
It was where that power was. And 458, developed plenty of power, but you'd need to be banging up above 8,000 to do it.
Yeah.
Whereas a 488 would be accelerating as hard as it was ever going to at, 4,000 or 5,000 revs. So it was so much more accessible. But, as we know, you turbocharge engines, you lose something, don't you?
So for a turbo engine, I remember thinking it was brilliantly responsive.
Exactly right.
For a turbo.
I agree.
But compared to a screaming NA-V8, it's just not the same.
No. And I don't
and the
know,
soundtrack's gone.
But I don't know this, actually. But my guess is that a late 458 is probably a more valuable car than an early 488.
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah.
Very possibly.
I would certainly understand it if it were the case. In fact, I'd be surprised if it wasn't.
Yeah. And then this bloodline ends with the F8 in 2019, which was essentially used the 488 Pista engine with 710 horsepower.
Yes.
And it was a fantastic car, actually, the F8. But it was very much a stopgap car, wasn't it?
Well, it was a facelift of a facelift.
Yeah. And it was just to get that model line to the start production of 296 GTB, wasn't it? The hybrid V6.
Exactly right. And, and I thought it was quite instructive that there was never a sort of hot version of the F8.
Yeah.
It was literally just to stretch it a little bit.
It was.
A car which started
extend the life.
458, just to extend the life until... so when did the 458 come out?
2009.
Yeah, and we think the F8 went to about 22. So that's a sort of like a 13, 14-year life cycle for one design. I mean, that's going some. But they needed to do that, didn't they? Because they needed to bridge the gap to the 296.
Yeah. I remember. So I did the F8 Tributo launch in 2019 at Maranello, which is always a great thing to do. You go there, you go to Fiorano, you drive it on track, and then you go into the hills, drive it on the road.
It's all about the restaurant.
Which one, though?
Montana.
Not the
Cavallino. No, Cavallino.
Which they've redone now, and it's Ferrari's own restaurant now.
Schmavellino.
Yeah, it's all about
Montana. If you want to go and be sort of reverential and eat off plates which have got prancing horses on where they are, then the Cavallino is the sort of classic. But actually, if you just want to go and eat really good Italian food in a fantastic atmosphere, go to Montana.
When the drivers are in town, they go to Montana.
Yeah.
So we did that as well. And it's a great thing to do those launches. It just feels like such a privilege. And I just remember thinking that F8 was maybe the most complete supercar I'd driven at that time. The engine works fantastically. It's so quick. The ride, the handling, the steering, just brilliant. So 458 super, super quick steering. Quite light, super quick. And you really have to dial into it and take your time to grow accustomed to that hyperactive rate of response.
And it's not just the gearing of the steering; it's the non-linear response of it.
Yeah.
So that you suddenly, if you come off centre, you suddenly get a very violent reaction. It's not the way that I would choose to set up a car steering. If you look at the way that Porsche do it and McLaren do it, they have slower racks. They have much more linear racks. But I guess it made the car feel, because you got a big reaction to any input, it made the car feel very agile and sporting, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Come the F8, though, that it was toned down a lot. Much more measured steering.
Yes.
They have this brilliant bumpy road button that just loosens the dampers a little bit, and they become lovely and supple, which is just great, particularly on our roads. Balance, super adjustable under power, coming out of the tight hairpin at Fiorano. You could just toy with it.
Yeah.
It's just amazing to me that a 700 horsepower car can be that playful at the limit, that easy, that adjustable, that accessible.
Yeah.
It's a hell of an achievement, that thing.
And did you ever think that when you were doing that, how much of this is me and how much of this is the car doing it for me? Because that side slip control they have is so...
Yeah. I don't think it matters.
No, probably
you
doesn't.
feel like it's you.
Yeah, exactly.
You feel like you're doing it. So, brilliant car. And so that is where that bloodline ended. Although we can talk about the special versions, can't we? There were slightly more sporting, limited versions of the earlier cars, but they're quite obscure. So really, it's the 360 Challenge Stradale that kicked it off, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Good car.
Lovely car. Lovely car.
Paddle shift only.
But it's sorted. It's like a sort of an SLS Black series, and I think we see there's a few cars where suddenly they produce a special edition, but actually it cures the problems of the. The thing about the SLS Black is not that it's terribly fast. It's just a car which just handles much nicer. It's much more reassuring. It's a much easier car to drive. Our Challenge Stradale is a much easier car to drive faster than a standard 360, and it didn't have that sort of roll-induced lurchy oversteer. It was I can't remember how much lighter it was, but it was it was stripped out. It was really focused, and. Yeah, I can remember just driving that, and almost like when I drove the F355 after the 348, just thinking, oh, so you can do it after all.
Why not do it all the time? Every time.
Why not do it all the time?
It's funny, isn't it? 430 Scuderia.
Yeah, good. Really good. To me, not quite as good as its reputation suggests.
The Scud.
Again,
paddle shift only. And from 458, all of these cars, even the standard ones, were paddle shift only. So talk to me about the Scuderia then. What just...
Oh, no, I've nothing bad to say about the Scud, as I think we always used to call it, at all. It just didn't... And to me, this has been a fairly familiar theme with these cars. And we'll come on to talk about... 458 Speciales and 488 Pistas as well. These were cars which I think were very popular because they were rarer and perceived to be more special, but actually, because I always judge a car on how usable it is. If a car is less comfortable and more noisy, you lose some of this. You lose a little bit of that. And I really like the Scuderia. I thought it was a fine car, very exciting, very fast, very dynamic. But yeah, again, it just hasn't lived with me. And I know that some people absolutely lionize them, and I'm not here to say that they're wrong at all. But it's just not one of those cars which, unlike the Challenge Stradale, I guess because the Challenge Stradale fixed a problem that was there, and with the F430 there wasn't a problem to fix. It stands out less.
So 458 Speciale, right? So I've never driven a standard 458, so I have to make that clear. I adore the 458 Speciale. I understand though. It is quite a raw car. It's so loud. It's
It's really loud.
Yeah,
it's oppressively loud at times.
It can be, and it's not the best soundtrack either. It's just very, very angry.
Yeah,
and very, very noisy. So I can understand that it's a less usable car, but my God, I've had some of the most exciting drives of my life in Speciales.
Yeah.
Just thing is, they're not just one thing or the other. They seem to do it all. So they again they have that bumpy road mode, so they can be supple and listen on a bumpy road. You know, they're not sort of head banging and horribly stiff at all. You can drive them super neat and accurate if you want to, you know, like a racing driver. You can hoof them about if that's what you want to do, and just so exciting. But I suppose the point you make is that it doesn't actually add much compared to the standard car, isn't it?
The point I would make is you've got to get to where you're going, and to get to where you're going probably involves sitting on a motorway.
Okay, fine.
Sometimes for some hours.
Yeah.
I can remember when I borrowed a 458 Speciale from Ferrari and I had to deliver it back to Slough. And because I can't remember what I was doing, I was going somewhere else or whatever, so I literally just drove it down the M4. Been quite glad to get out of it. I'd had enough. And maybe that says more about me than it does about the Speciale. But you know, when the standard 458 was such a wonderful thing to drive in its own right, but it didn't make you have to go through that. I just wondered, I don't think what's the point. I understand the point entirely, but to me, the gain was too marginal for the loss that came with it.
Okay, I understand that,
and that is very much a minority view, and I accept that.
I think the counterpoint is that when you are on the road, when you are on the right track,
of course,
just it's electric, that thing. And there are people out there who, if they've got a special car tucked away for the weekend, they want it to feel thrilling and exciting the moment they roll out the driveway, don't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it is that.
Yes.
The 488 Speciale.
Huge sense of occasion.
Is car. That, yeah. 488 Pista. So I remember being at Anglesey with Autocar.
I think I was there.
Yeah, I think you were there. And strapping myself into that thing because it had harnesses and pulling out the pit lane. And by the end of the first lap, skidding it around the hairpins and just absolutely honking around in it.
This is the event when they turned up with carbon wheels
and those tyres that will do 3 laps, and then they
the cup 2 Rs they turned up with. Yes, they basically you got 3 decent laps out of them before they started to tail off. Yeah,
but what blew me away was this was a mid-engine 700 horsepower supercar. And within a lap, I was driving it absolutely as hard and as fast as I dared.
And that is the real achievement of those cars.
Yeah,
that they are that accessible. And if you think how far they've come from all those early cars we've been talking about with their dodgy handling, and you think about the forces involved with something like a Pista, and how Ferrari has learnt how to control those so that you can. This car with so much more grip, so much more weight, so much more power, so much more torque, so much more everything, and yet it is wildly, incomparably more easy to drive and controllable than a 308 GTB.
It is amazing.
It is amazing.
It's absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
And it shows the progress Ferrari made over those decades with chassis tuning, with chassis electronics. It's just extraordinary how easy those cars are to drive really, really fast and really, really hard.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the drop-top versions?
We can. I wasn't expecting to, but...
No, I know. Well, I just remember driving a 488 Spider.
Yeah.
So the first turbo one, up against I'm sure it was a McLaren 650S. And the Ferrari had a nicer engine. But I could not believe how wobbly it was. So this is probably in 2016.
Whereas the McLaren would have made no difference at all.
Made no difference.
Yeah.
But the way this thing rattled about, the steering wheel moving around the cabin, you can always tell when you look at the rearview mirror in these cars, if the structure is stiff, you've got like a 4K HD image in the rearview mirror. If the structure isn't, it's blurry.
Yes.
And the Ferrari just rattled about all over the place, and I just couldn't put up with that.
Yeah,
I'd hate it.
Well, I mean, try a 308 GTS and see how you get on.
I'm sure.
And actually, all these cars, they're only really Targas, aren't they? Essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not fully convertible cars.
No.
But what you're looking at there is a car that is made out of metal, as opposed to one that's made out of carbon, like the McLaren. And there's a trade-off, isn't it? You can put a lot of the strength back, but only by adding weight. And maybe there's a calculation that is made, which is that the sort of person who would choose a convertible Ferrari over a coupe Ferrari may not be that bothered about, on-limit dynamics. And so maybe, it's not the end of the world if it's not that stiff. I mean, I've never driven any of those cars, from the 308 right up to, the very last of them, which I thought was in any way more desirable than the coupe upon which it was based. None of them.
No.
But then I can say the same about 911s as well. So, I think we're just talking about... They're not cars that are designed for people like me.
No.
Or I suspect you.
No, I don't think they are. They serve a purpose, don't they? And that's fine. So which would you choose to own? Money aside.
Of them all, oh, blimey. I think it would be a standard 458 Italia or a Challenge Stradale. Actually, no, I'd have both, wouldn't I? Because I'd have the 458 for just going about in, and I'd have the Challenge Stradale for weekends.
See, I would choose for regular use a 488 or an F8. Yes. I actually like the torque.
Yeah,
I do like the torque and the slightly more muted soundtrack. Yeah. I would feel a bit of a dick screaming around the countryside or out of a village in an NA Ferrari. That's just me.
I think a 488 is a very underrated car. I think, and probably quite an affordable car now. If you just got a 7 or 8 year old 488 GTB, I don't know what you pay for one of those, but that would be quite a thing.
It'd be lovely.
Yeah, and you wouldn't believe how fast it still feels.
Oh yeah, it would.
Absolute missile.
I think as a weekend toy, without having driven one, I'd love to have a 355 stashed away.
Early one,
early one. I just think
they were the first Ferraris to get paddles, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't bother.
Don't bother with paddles. If you have the option of a manual, go manual.
6-speed manual.
Absolutely. In every case.
Are we going to talk about 288s and F40s? And I mean, they're not really part of the bloodline, are they? But they are mid-engine 2-seat Ferraris.
I think we probably have to save those for another episode, don't we?
Okay.
Have you driven any of the race cars? Because most of these spawned, one-make competition cars or GT4, GT3 cars.
Yeah, so what have I driven? I've driven a 355 challenge car.
Ooh.
I've driven a 488 challenge car. What else have I driven? I've driven a couple of 488 challenge cars, actually. That might be it, actually. I haven't driven... I'd love to have a go at a GT3.
Yeah.
That would be a weapon, wouldn't it?
The GTEs won Le Mans a couple of times, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
The 458s.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Proper motorsport pedigree there. How was the 355 challenge? Was it a properly sorted racing? The thing about these challenge cars is that they don't need to be that good because they're for one make competition, aren't they?
Well, okay, so there was a big difference. So the 355 challenge, when I drove that, that was a road car with a bit of suspension and some slicks. And I only drove it. I drove it at Fiorano. Had a nice time. Actually, had a great time in it. It was because it was based on a 355, because it was based on an already lovely car. It was great fun. But if you drive a 488 challenge car, they are built separately as racing cars, and you can tell in every way that this is a car that was only ever designed to be a racing car. They are unbelievable.
Wow.
I've got a friend who worked for a brilliant company called Bell Sport and Classic.
Yeah.
And they have a Ferrari one make series, and they were doing a sort of customer demonstration day. So they asked me to go along and drive their 488 challenge, which they had a passenger seat in, and just take punters around. And so I spent a day driving around Donington in this. I can't tell you how much fun I had.
Yeah, brilliant.
The wonderful thing about them is they are to me what proper one-make racers should be, because they haven't got enormous amounts of downforce, they've got very little downforce, but they've got ridiculous amounts of power.
Yeah.
So they're really, really wild rides.
Yeah.
And all the better for it.
That sounds great.
You just go steaming up to stuff, chuck it in, sort it out, and fabulous things.
Well, there you go. That is the arguably, potentially, debatably the greatest supercar bloodline there will ever be. Maybe.
Certainly among mid-engine Ferrari 2CVs.
Now, listen. We are offering all podcast listeners a 15% discount on the cost of subscribing to our multi-award winning, ad-free online car magazine. There's nothing else like it out there. It's one of a kind, isn't it? And people seem to really like it. The feedback that we get is
incredible,
just extraordinary. So thank you to everyone who takes the time to let us know what you think of it. If you have been meaning to subscribe and you haven't done so yet, there will be a link in the description, or you can just head to the-intercooler.com, and at checkout use coupon code POD15, and that will get you a 15% discount for life on the cost of subscribing. People like it. We love it. We love doing it. It's actually far and away the bigger part of what we do.